The gavel struck like a gunshot. The marble walls of the courtroom caught the echo and sent it rolling back over the audience, a wave of sudden silence. Judge Edith Jones leaned forward, her eyes cold and steady, her voice slicing through the air. This courtroom demands respect, not attitude. Murmurs rippled across the benches. Cameras clicked. Every lens turned toward the woman standing at the defense table, Jasmine Crockett, her chin slightly lifted, her hands resting calmly in front of her. The light from the overhead fixture gleamed on the polished surface, catching the faint tremor of her breath. She didn't answer right away. The pause was long enough to feel like defiance, short enough to still be grace. Her eyes met the judge's, not with hostility, but a kind of poised disbelief, the kind that said, "I've been told to sit down before." Reporters scribbled notes. A court officer shifted uneasily. It wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It had become theater. The audience didn't yet know who the villain was or the hero. They only knew tension had stepped into the room and taken a seat beside them. Judge Jones adjusted her glasses. "You may continue if you can manage a tone appropriate to this court." A low chuckle slipped from somewhere in the back row, quickly hushed. Jasmine's fingers tightened just once, barely perceptible. She inhaled, then spoke, her voice controlled but edged with something electric. "Your Honor, my tone reflects my truth. If that's inappropriate, I suppose the truth often is." A gasp, a flash. Every camera captured the stillness that followed. The judge blinked, expression unreadable, her authority momentarily suspended in the charged quiet. In that instant, time held its breath. One woman embodied the system, rigid, untouchable, certain. The other embodied the challenge, dignified, unapologetic, unshaken. And while no one moved, everyone watching felt the balance shift, subtle, imperceptible, but real. The gavel rusted, the judge's hand hovering above it. Jasmine didn't look away. Because she knew this was no longer about the case. It was about who truly deserved to be heard. And what happened next would leave the entire courtroom in disbelief. 2 hours earlier, before the cameras were switched on and the nation turned its eyes to the courtroom, the air had already been thick with expectation. This wasn't just another hearing. It was a test of image and ideology, a quiet duel between generations. Jasmine Crockett had arrived early, shoulders squared, expression calm but unreadable. She knew every move she made would be dissected later, replayed, judged. Her team whispered final notes. Outside, a crowd gathered, cell phones raised, voices blending into a low hum of divided loyalties. Some came to support her, the young Congresswoman who spoke with fire and didn't apologize for it. Others came to see her humbled. Either way, everyone knew something combustible was about to unfold. Inside, the courtroom felt like a stage waiting for its cue. The portraits of old judges lined the walls, their painted eyes a reminder of tradition, hierarchy, control. At the center sat Edith Jones, a woman whose authority was carved from decades of rulings and reprimands. She believed in order, obedience, and the sanctity of her word. To her, Crockett's style was rebellion disguised as confidence. But for Jasmine, it wasn't rebellion at all. It was survival, the kind learned from years of walking into rooms not built for her voice. She didn't posture, she prepared. She carried not just her own reputation, but the weight of every woman who had ever been labeled too loud, too emotional, or too much. The opening statements were routine at first. Legal decorum filled the air like static, polished words, restrained gestures. Yet beneath the surface, something was straining to break free. Judge Jones's tone grew firmer each time Jasmine pushed back, each correction sharper than the last. The audience felt it, the clash of two worlds colliding over something deeper than law. By the time the cameras began rolling, the shift was unmistakable. The judge's patience had thinned, the Congresswoman's resolve had solidified. It wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about identity, about space, about voice. Jasmine leaned into the microphone, her tone deliberate. "I've come here to answer your questions, Your Honor. But if my passion is mistaken for attitude, maybe the problem isn't my tone." The words landed heavy. Gasps again. Phones lifted discreetly, capturing the tension that would soon go viral. Judge Jones adjusted in her chair, lips pressing into a line. "You will address this court with the respect it deserves." Jasmine didn't flinch. "Respect is mutual, Your Honor." The silence that followed was electric. Reporters scribbled faster now. Even the bailiff avoided eye contact. Something irreversible had just happened. A moment when authority cracked and truth seeped through the fault line. For those watching, it was no longer a legal exchange. It was symbolic, a reflection of a larger struggle playing out across the country. Old power trying to silence new voices, tradition trying to tame authenticity. And as the judge prepared her next remark, a flicker of unease crossed her face, just for a moment, but enough to show that the balance of control was beginning to slip. Because what Jasmine said next would not only defend her dignity, it would expose something about the courtroom itself that no one had dared to say aloud. And when she did, every camera would still be rolling. For decades, Judge Edith Jones had ruled her courtroom like a fortress, a place where her word was law and her tone the final judgment. She was known for her efficiency, her no-nonsense approach, and the cutting sharpness of her reprimands. Lawyers whispered her name with a mix of fear and respect. She was not cruel, they said, just unflinchingly certain. But certainty, left unexamined, has a way of hardening into something else. Her career had been built on that hardness. Born into a family of jurists, Edith carried the legacy of old Southern courts, places where authority was inherited, not earned. She rose fast, earning accolades for her precision and discipline. Colleagues admired her intellect, but noted her distance. Compassion to her was weakness. She often said justice had no room for feelings. In private, though, the world had begun to shift around her. The country she once presided over with absolute command now spoke a different language, one of identity, empathy, and equity. Younger judges were talking about reform, representation, and cultural humility. To Edith, it all felt like erosion. The courtroom was supposed to be sacred, not a platform for emotion. And then came Jasmine Crockett, a name she'd seen in headlines long before she saw the woman in person, a congresswoman unafraid to speak with conviction, unafraid to question the tone of those who ruled. Edith had read those clips with a raised eyebrow. Another loud one, she thought. A familiar judgment forming before the gavel ever met the bench. The morning of the hearing, she reviewed the case file meticulously, highlighting passages that reinforced her control. A judge must never yield, she told herself. Not to politics, not to passion. Her assistants watched her with quiet obedience. They knew what that meant.
She would not be challenged, not today. By the time Jasmine entered the courtroom, Edith had already decided how this would go. She saw the younger woman's confidence not as self-assurance, but as insolence. Every expression, every pause, every glance became proof in her mind. The judge believed she was defending order, but really, she was defending an era, one that was fading faster than she could admit. Throughout her career, Edith had faced critics who said she lacked empathy, that her harshness crossed the line into bias. She dismissed them all. Justice isn't soft, she'd remind herself. Yet deep down, she feared the day someone would force her to look at the human cost of her authority. That day had arrived. In that moment, standing before Jasmine Crockett, Edith Jones wasn't just a judge. She was the embodiment of a mindset. That coward demands obedience, not dialogue. The courtroom wasn't a space of law anymore. It was a microcosm of America's cultural reckoning. Her voice, though calm, carried the undercurrent of defensiveness. "You will answer the question directly," she had said earlier, her tone clipped. She believed she was asserting discipline. To the audience, it sounded like dismissal. As Jasmine met her gaze with quiet steadiness, something flickered behind the judge's eyes. Not fear, but recognition. She'd seen this defiance before. In younger lawyers, in protesters on TV, in her own daughter once, years ago. The realization unsettled her, that the world she was defending no longer recognized her as its voice. She felt the cameras on her, the weight of the audience's scrutiny, and suddenly, her authority didn't feel like armor. It felt like glass. For the first time in her career, she hesitated before speaking, just a breath, but enough to show that the woman she faced was not like the others who'd folded under her tone. Jasmine wasn't intimidated. She was illuminated by purpose. And that terrified Edith Jones more than she'd ever admit. She lifted her gavel again, more for reassurance than for order. The room waited, but her certainty was gone, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't name, perhaps doubt, perhaps admiration, perhaps fear. Whatever it was the first crack in the marble of her command, and soon, everyone in that courtroom would see it break wide open. Long before Jasmine Crockett stood beneath the blinding lights of that courtroom, she had learned what it meant to be underestimated. Her story didn't begin in polished halls or ivy-covered universities. It began in the hum of a South Dallas neighborhood where dreams were measured not by privilege, but persistence. The rhythm of her world was fast, real, and unapologetic. Every corner, every conversation was a classroom in resilience. Her mother worked double shifts. Her father fixed cars until midnight. They taught her that silence might be safe, but it never built justice. So, Jasmine spoke up early, in classrooms, in community meetings, at kitchen tables where the grown-ups debated over unpaid bills and unfair laws. "Use your voice," her mother would say, "but make sure it's sharper than their excuses." Law came naturally to her, not as theory, but as necessity. She saw what happened when people didn't understand their rights, when systems preyed on confusion. At Howard, she absorbed the mechanics of power, the choreography of rhetoric. But while others softened their tone to fit in, Jasmine learned to make hers impossible to ignore. Professors warned her that passion could be misread. She smiled and replied, "That's not my problem. That's their projection." Her rise wasn't smooth. She was dismissed, doubted, and told she was too emotional, more times than she could count. Yet every insult became another layer of armor. She ran for office not because she wanted power, but because she was tired of watching power ignore the powerless. When she spoke, people listened, not because she was loud, but because she was real. Her speeches were a mixture of heart and heat, threaded with the rhythm of her roots. The establishment called it attitude. Her supporters called it honesty. Either way, her name became a symbol of the woman who didn't bow, who didn't dilute, who didn't shrink. But fame came with friction. Networks edited her sound bites to exaggerate the bite. Commentators reduced her substance to style. She's angry, they'd say. She's theatrical. She never answered them directly. She didn't have to. Her work did that for her. So when she received the notice that she'd been summoned to appear before Judge Edith Jones, she knew what she was walking into. The setting might be formal, but the script was old. A woman of color in a space built to keep her tone contained. She knew the rhythm of that ritual, the condescension disguised as civility, the smirk that meant, know your place. But Jasmine didn't come to perform respectability. She came to stand her ground. Her team warned her. This judge can be ruthless. Keep calm, don't feed the tension. Jasmine nodded, but inside she understood something deeper. Calmness wasn't the absence of fire, it was control of it. That morning, she dressed not for optics, but intention. A soft navy suit, gold earrings shaped like flames, subtle but symbolic. As she looked in the mirror, she whispered to herself, "You don't owe them smaller." Walking into the courthouse, she could feel the eyes, reporters, critics, staffers waiting for her to stumble. The old marble steps seemed to test her resolve with every echoing heel. Each stride was a reminder of the miles she'd already walked, the ceilings she'd already cracked. When she finally entered the courtroom, the first thing she noticed wasn't the grandeur. It was the weight of expectation. The air carried history, and not all of it welcoming. Yet beneath that pressure, her heartbeat stayed steady. Every inhale, every exhale was a prayer, a protest, and a promise. As Judge Edith Jones took her seat, Jasmine read the energy like a map. Every tilt of the head, every clipped syllable, every subtle cue of superiority. She'd seen it all before. But what the judge didn't see was that Jasmine had walked through tougher rooms where people didn't just question her tone, but her right to exist in the conversation. She smiled faintly. This was just another test, another echo of the same old challenge. And yet somewhere deep in her chest, she felt something different this time. Not anger, not defensiveness, but clarity. She wasn't here to prove her worth. She was here to hold a mirror up to the system itself. As the bailiff called the court to order, Jasmine straightened, hands clasped lightly in front of her. She could sense the moment forming before it began. A collision between decorum and truth, between the old way and the new. In that quiet heartbeat before the gavel struck, she thought of every woman told to soften her edge, every dreamer told to dim their light. Her lips parted in a whisper only she could hear. Let's begin. And when she looked up, her eyes didn't meet authority, they met history. Because in this courtroom, it wasn't just a hearing, it was an awakening. And it was about to catch fire. The gavel cracked through the silence like thunder through still air. Every head lifted, every camera lens sharpened its focus. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a stage, and both women knew it. Judge Edith Jones sat poised, a mask of authority carved in decades of power. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett stood calm, unflinching, every muscle disciplined by years of battles she was never meant to win. The exchange began with civility, the kind that trembles under the weight of something brewing. "Representative Crockett's," Judge Jones began, her voice smooth but sharpened at the edges. "You've been summoned to account for the language you used in your recent statements. Many consider your tone unprofessional for a public servant." That word, tone, hung heavy in the air. Jasmine's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Not yet. She wanted the silence to work for her. Around them, whispers ripples like static. Jones leaned forward. I'll remind you that this is not a campaign rally. You are in a federal courtroom. We expect composure. Jasmine inhaled slowly. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the precision of someone who had learned to weaponize calm. With all due respect, Your Honor, composure isn't the same as silence, and professionalism shouldn't be confused with submission. A murmur broke through the crowd. The judge's eyes narrowed. Miss Crockett, she said, each word clipped. I would advise you to answer questions directly, not lecture this court on semantics. Jasmine's gaze stayed locked. Then perhaps the court should stop mistaking expression for aggression. Gasps. The bailiff shifted. The clerk pretended to adjust papers just to avoid looking at anyone. For a flicker of a second, Judge Jones' facade wavered. The faintest glint of irritation flashed before she blinked it away. You are skating dangerously close to contempt, Representative.
Contempt, Jasmine repeated softly, almost to herself. You mean like the kind that's shown every time a woman of color is told her confidence is hostility? Or the kind that makes a courtroom forget who it's supposed to protect? Jones' gavel slammed. Enough! But it wasn't enough. Not for Jasmine. The room could feel her resolve hardening, like steel under flame. Your Honor, she said, I understand this court values order, but order without justice is just control, and I didn't come here to play controlled. The judge leaned back, trying to reclaim the moment. You seem to enjoy turning every question into a speech. And you seem to enjoy mistaking discomfort for disrespect, Jasmine shot back, her tone still even, surgical, deliberate. But maybe discomfort is what progress sounds like. The audience held its breath. Somewhere, a reporter's pen froze mid-sentence. Cameras zoomed closer. Jones' lips pursed. You think this performance makes you powerful? No, I think truth does. The two women stared at each other, two eras colliding in real time. The room felt it too. The tension wasn't about law anymore. It was about legitimacy. Who gets to speak? Who gets to define the boundaries of respect? Jones broke the silence. You're very good at deflection, Representative, but this isn't Congress. You're not protected by applause here. Jasmine's response came like a heartbeat. Then I'll rely on principle instead. Even her critics couldn't deny it. There was a presence about her that felt uncontainable. Not loud, not reckless, but inevitable. Like someone who knew that even if she lost this hearing, the world outside these marble walls would remember every word. The judge gathered her papers, pretending to focus on procedure, but the air was no longer hers to command. Jasmine had shifted the energy. The courtroom, once a theater of intimidation, now vibrated with awareness. People were watching, not just in the room, but across screens, across timelines, across generations. And Jasmine knew it. So when Judge Jones attempted to reassert control, Representative Crockett, I am not here to debate ideology. Jasmine interrupted softly. No, you're here to maintain hierarchy. And I'm here to question why that hierarchy still looks the same after all these decades. That was the moment the room turned. Not with noise, but with realization. A hush that wasn't silence, but awe. Jones, visibly unsettled, straightened. This is not the place for speeches.
Maybe not, Jasmine said, voice lowering. But history doesn't ask for permission before it happens. The gavel struck again, harder this time. Representative Crockett, this hearing is adjourned until further notice. But Jasmine didn't move. She stood tall, unflinching, her eyes fixed on the judge, not with anger, but with something more dangerous, understanding. Because in that instant, both women knew this wasn't the end of a confrontation. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And as Jasmine turned to leave, the murmurs behind her weren't whispers anymore. They were sparks. Quiet, rising, unstoppable. Something had shifted in that courtroom. And the world, whether it liked it or not, had just witnessed the first crack in a very old wall. The following morning, the story had already escaped the courtroom. Clips of the confrontation flooded social media. Hashtags like Crockett Platback and Truth in Court blazed across timelines. But while the country argued online, Jasmine Crockett walked back into that same courtroom with the calm of someone who slept soundly. She knew what was coming. She had studied this playbook her entire life. The reprimands after the resistance, the punishment for breaking the invisible rules. And yet as she took her seat, every camera seemed to sense that something different was about to happen. Judge Edith Jones entered, her robe sweeping like a shadow. The murmurs died. The air felt denser, as though the building itself braced for what was about to unfold. Jones' voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed fatigue. Before we resume, I will address yesterday's disruption. Representative Crockett, you will have the opportunity to make a statement, provided it remains within the boundaries of respect. Jasmine rose slowly, smoothing her blazer. Respect, she said softly, isn't silence, Your Honor. And I'd like to make that clear before I begin. A flicker crossed the judge's face. Irritation, maybe curiosity. Jasmine didn't wait. She took a step forward, her voice carrying the precision of conviction. For too long, she began, we've mistaken composure for compliance. We've been told that if we lower our voice, we'll be heard, that if we shrink ourselves, we'll be seen. But I've learned that some rooms are built so you'll never fit unless you break the frame. The courtroom leaned forward. The judge said nothing. Jasmine continued. Yesterday, I was told I had an attitude. Maybe I do, but that attitude comes from generations who were told they were too loud, too proud, too brown, too different. It's the same attitude that built this country and never got credit for it. A reporter's pen slipped from his hand. A clerk paused mid-note. Jasmine looked directly at Judge Jones. I don't stand here to insult this court. I stand here to remind it. Justice doesn't look one way, sound one way, or speak in one tone. And if my presence feels disruptive, maybe it's because truth has a habit of making comfort uncomfortable. The silence was thick. Even the judge didn't interrupt. Your Honor, you told me this courtroom demands respect, and I agree. But respect is earned by fairness, not fear. You see, my ancestors respected this nation enough to believe in its promise, even when it didn't believe in them. So when I speak, I do it out of respect for that promise. And if that's seen as rebellion, then maybe rebellion is what justice looks like in motion. A low murmur spread through the crowd, not outrage, but awe. Even those who had come expecting spectacle found themselves listening. Jones leaned forward slightly. Your Honor, this is not a platform for political performance. Jasmine smiled faintly, her tone unwavering. With all due respect, Your Honor, Justice is always political when it decides who gets to speak and who gets silenced. Gasps echoed across the room. A few people clapped before the bailiff's glare silenced them. Jones's hammer hovered midair, but Jasmine pressed on, her words sharper now, not from anger, but from control. You called my attitude disrespectful, but if I came here quiet, I'd be called weak. If I came here angry, I'd be called unfit. So tell me, Your Honor, what tone is left for women like me? The one that makes you comfortable or the one that makes me free? That line cracked through the air like lightning. Reporters caught it instantly. Tweets were already flying before she even finished. Jasmine paused, letting the silence expand, letting her words settle deep. Then she continued, softer this time. I understand this courtroom was built on precedent, but progress has never followed precedent. It breaks it. And if standing my ground makes me difficult, then I'll be difficult with purpose. Jones opened her mouth to respond, but Jasmine wasn't done. Because when I walk out of this courtroom, there are little girls watching this moment. Girls who are learning whether they can speak their minds without being labeled emotional. Boys learning whether power means listening or dominating. I won't teach them that silence is safety. Every camera shutter clicked like applause. Jasmine's tone softened again, not pleading, but grounded. So no, Your Honor, I won't apologize for my tone. I will, however, apologize to history for every time we stayed quiet when we should have spoken, for every time we made dignity small enough to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. That ends here. The judge's expression faltered. The gavel lowered, but never struck. Jasmine's final words came low, intimate, like she wasn't speaking to the judge anymore, but to the room, to the country beyond it. Maybe this courtroom doesn't need another ruling today. Maybe it needs a reminder that power isn't proven by who silences whom, but by who dares to speak truth even when it shakes the walls. The pause that followed wasn't silence. It was a held breath, a collective heartbeat suspended in reverence. Judge Jones finally spoke, voice quieter now. Representative Crockett, you've made your point. No, Your Honor, we've all just heard it. And with that, she turned, walking back to her seat, the sound of her heels echoing through the chamber like punctuation marks at the end of an era. The gavel struck once, not with anger, but resignation. The judge's eyes followed Jasmine, not with disdain, but something resembling reflection. Outside, as the doors opened, sunlight poured in. The crowd waiting beyond erupted, reporters shouting questions, supporters cheering, even critics left speechless. But Jasmine didn't wave, didn't speak. She simply raised her head and walked through the flash of cameras, calm, unshaken, unbent. Because the real verdict had already been delivered, not by the judge, but by the people watching who saw, maybe for the first time, what courage in its purest form looks like when it refuses to lower its tone. And as the footage went viral, one caption summed it up perfectly. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. But what came next would make the entire nation choose a side. By nightfall, the world had already picked a side. The video of Jasmine Crockett's courtroom takedown had become inescapable. Stitched, clipped, remixed, quoted. One moment of defiance had exploded into a national reckoning. Every platform was on fire. On TikTok, creators mouth her words. What tone is left for women like me? On X, the quote trended under a blazing hashtag, #tone of truth. Commentators who had once dismissed her now called it the speech that redrew the line between power and respect. Cable news panels lit up like battlegrounds. On one channel, conservative pundits framed her as a dangerous symbol of emotion overtaking order. On another, progressive anchors described her as the conscience America keeps trying to silence. But the clip, the one moment that silenced even her critics, was the look on Judge Edith Jones's face. That flicker of hesitation, that split second where the symbol of old power met the mirror of new truth. It was memed, gifted, replayed millions of times. The caption read simply, "When power realizes it blinked first." In downtown Dallas, murals began to appear. Jasmine's silhouette painted in bold strokes, the words, "Respect isn't silence," glowing underneath. Students carried signs with her quote at rallies. The moment had transformed from a courtroom confrontation into a cultural earthquake. But the virality wasn't just about admiration. It was division, raw and unfiltered. Editorials thundered in both directions. The Dallas Tribune declared, "Crockett's courage redefines leadership." Meanwhile, the Sentinel Review countered with, "When dignity drowns in drama." Each headline poured gasoline on the conversation. And Jasmine, she stayed silent. No interviews, no statements, just composure. The same calm that once unsettled a courtroom now amplified her mystique. Behind the scenes, the establishment scrambled. Judge Jones' chambers released a formal notice defending judicial decorum, but even that statement was drowned out by the noise. Senators weighed in. Talk shows turned the confrontation into nightly theater. Some called Jasmine a firebrand. Others called her the future. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Text from fellow lawmakers, messages from activists, and even calls from celebrities offering solidarity. Yet, Jasmine responded to almost no one. She didn't need to. The message had already outgrown her voice. Then came the late-night talk shows. One host, leaning back in his chair, said to a roaring audience, she didn't lose her cool, she just made justice cool again. The crowd erupted. Clips went viral again. Even international outlets picked up the story. In London, The Guardian wrote, "An American courtroom moment becomes a global metaphor for defiance with grace." But for Jasmine, it wasn't about global headlines. She knew the real battle wasn't on screens. It was in hearts. She'd exposed something deeper, how quickly dignity becomes threatening when it doesn't bow. Judge Edith Jones, meanwhile, faced her own storm. Protesters appeared outside her courthouse holding signs that read, "We heard her tone. We heard your silence." News anchors questioned whether her reaction reflected bias. For the first time in her decades-long career, Jones avoided cameras. Back in Washington, whispers began about hearings, about reform, about representation. Jasmine's name was suddenly on everyone's lips, but not as a politician, as a movement. A viral tweet from a young woman captured it best. They told her to be quiet. She answered with history. The thread beneath it filled with stories, women, immigrants, young men, all describing moments when they'd been told to adjust their tone. Each one ended the same way. Not anymore. But even as the digital firestorm grew, something quieter began to stir.
Late one night, an anonymous post appeared on a legal forum. Judge Jones didn't expect to be shaken that day, but I saw it in her eyes, the realization that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the hero of this story. No one confirmed who wrote it, but it spread anyway, fueling the mystery, deepening the myth. By the end of the week, one thing was clear. The courtroom walls hadn't just echoed a gavel, they'd echoed a shift in culture. Every generation has a moment when truth stops asking for permission.
And this one had found its voice in Jasmine Crockett. But as support swelled and cameras followed, Jasmine understood something others didn't. Viral moments fade. The system doesn't. And as the world crowned her a symbol, she began preparing for what symbols always face next, the backlash. Because when dignity dares to speak too loud, power always whispers back, plotting its return. Days turned into weeks, and the frenzy began to cool, but the conversation refused to die. The noise of hashtags faded into something quieter, deeper, reflection. Everywhere Jasmine went, people stopped her, in airports, coffee shops, outside community halls. They didn't ask for selfies. They said things like, "My daughter watched that clip. She stood taller at school the next day." Or, "I spoke up in a meeting for the first time because of you." For the first time in her career, Jasmine realized this wasn't about her anymore. It was about the permission she'd given others to be unapologetically themselves. But even symbols need solitude. One evening, she stood alone on the steps of the courthouse, the same building where she'd been told to control her tone. The sun was setting, painting the marble columns gold. In that fading light, it didn't look like a fortress anymore. It looked human, fallible. She thought about Judge Edith Jones, the sharp words, the cold authority, the gavel that had tried to cut her voice in half. She wondered if the judge ever replayed that day in her mind, not with bitterness, but with recognition. Because truth once spoken lingers in even the hardest hearts. A camera crew passed by, hoping for a comment. She waved them off politely. This moment wasn't for performance. It was for peace. Jasmine closed her eyes and remembered the sound of that gavel, the echo that once felt like an ending. Now, it sounded more like punctuation between chapters. She had realized something profound. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to bow. That was the real lesson, that dignity is not silence and respect is not obedience. Every person told to fix their tone had been fighting the same quiet battle, to exist fully without apology. In interviews that followed, Jasmine was asked whether she regretted confronting the judge. She smiled. No, because it wasn't confrontation, it was clarity. And clarity can look like defiance when people mistake comfort for justice. That line would be quoted everywhere, but the meaning ran deeper than any headline could carry. It was a reminder that justice doesn't live in the loud moments. It lives in the quiet conviction to stand tall when standing tall is inconvenient. And slowly, even her critics softened. An op-ed by a retired judge surprised everyone. Perhaps we too must learn to listen differently. Decorum means little if its silence is truth. That sentence, coming from the old guard itself, marked something rare: growth. Back home, Jasmine received a letter in looping cursive. No signature, no returned address, just one line. "You made me see myself in the mirror, and I didn't like what I saw. Thank you." She didn't need to know who it was from. She already knew. As she walked away from the courthouse for the last time, A breeze lifted her hair. The camera still waited, but she didn't look back. Because she understood what power really was. Not control, not status, not even victory. Power was grace under fire. Power was choosing dignity over dominance. Power was speaking truth, not to be loud, but to be heard. And so, as the lights of the city flickered on and the courthouse faded behind her, Jasmine Crockett carried no bitterness, only purpose. Because the real verdict had already been delivered, not by the judge, not by the media, but by a nation quietly realizing that respect doesn't flow downward from authority, it rises upward from courage. And somewhere, in the echo of that gavel, a new kind of justice had begun to speak, in every voice that refused to lower its tone again. The image of Jasmine Crockett standing tall in that courtroom had already become more than a viral moment. It had become a blueprint, a reminder that truth doesn't need permission, and that dignity, when spoken aloud, can shake even the most unshakable rooms. As the final headlines faded and the algorithms moved on, her story didn't. It lived in every conversation, every classroom debate. Every whispered, "I wish I'd said that," turned into, "Next time, I will." Because that's what real change sounds like. Not the war of outrage, but the quiet courage of millions deciding they won't shrink anymore. If you felt something watching this story, if you saw a reflection of your own battles in Jasmine's strength, don't let it end here. Share this story. Keep it alive. Remind the world that tone isn't the problem, indifference is. That justice doesn't need volume to be heard, it needs conviction. Subscribe if you believe that truth, dignity, and courage still belong in public life. Share this if you believe that one person's composure can challenge an entire system's comfort. Because the next time someone tells you to lower your tone, remember, your voice might be the one that wakes the room. And history never forgets the ones who spoke when silence was safer.